First of all, let me speak about some general aspects of the war. I need that in order to speak about truth and lies situation. It will be helpful. And then at the end, I will try to analyze some typical notions of conflict resolution who are now under some question during this war. At least I'll invite you for the discussion on that. So let me start with the global aspects of the war. This war is being held on the Ukrainian territory, though it is not only the Ukrainian war. As it was recently stated by a group of Ukrainian public leaders, I quote, Ukraine has proven that it doesn't seek to outsource its defense against Russia to others. But today's war against Russia is a war not only for Ukraine. This is a war of civilization against barbarism, of dignity against depravity, and of freedom against slavery. There is no reason why Ukraine should be left alone in this fight, end quote. Ukrainian historian Myroslav Marynovych explained that in the following way. Ukraine is Palestine of the 21st century. It is seemingly a local conflict, but has a decisive impact on the world politics. Therefore, there will be no separate Ukrainian solution and no separate global solution. Vice versa, the Ukrainian solution will be part of a global solution. What is important is that Ukraine is taking part in it already, end quote. The reminding about Palestine is at the same time a gentle reminding about values, because we cannot imagine Palestine of the first century without mentioning values. And let me analyze today global aspect exactly from the point of values, of course, with Christian background. Today, the world faces the dilemma of values versus security. And I'm not sure that all the politicians remember the famous phrase by Benjamin Franklin. They who can give up essential liberty to obtain a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. The time we live in, end quote, the time we live in forces us to rephrase these words in the following way. They who can give up essential values to obtain a little temporary safety deserve neither values nor safety. The following phrase is widely known in the West. Let us never negotiate out of fear. Unfortunately, for too long, the fear of the Third World War forced the world to solve the dilemma of security versus values in favor of security, which only brought the world closer to what it feared. Putin lives in the culture when the will to find a compromise is the sign of weakness. So the Western principle of a dialogue at any cost was transformed into his mind into the formula aggression without any limits. building bridges to evil turned out to be feeding the mania of the monster. Therefore, the more you ignore the values through unjust concessions to the aggressor, the more arrogant he becomes and the lesser safety you obtain. And it was Jesus who warned us about that. He who seeks to save his life shall lose it, and he who loses his life for my sake shall find it. Matthew 5:34. The tragedy of our time is the fact that we cannot find a way out of an apparently insurmountable dilemma. On the one hand, in the year 2014, when Russia annexed the Crimea and occupied another part of Ukrainian territory, many Western politicians admitted that international order was broken and proper civilizational values have been shunted aside. However, these politicians were not ready to defend the system and values resolutely, because they believe that open confrontation with violators will almost certainly cause a third world war. I'm aware that the dilemma of values versus security is not easy to solve, and therefore I hesitate to judge today's politicians too harshly. However, I also know that international order cannot be restored with the cooperation of regimes that violate international order. The world has lost 8 years trying to cajole the aggressor. However, this is precisely the trap. Ignoring values brings such disturbances into the life of the world that it is precisely what they want to protect, security, that is under threat. And the latest weeks just confirm that we are closer to the World War III than in the year 2014. You might object to my conclusion about ignoring values. However, let us look to the situation with the 1994 Budapest Memorandum. According to the latter, the US, the UK, and the Russian Federation promised to guarantee the territorial integrity of Ukraine. In reality, Russia has annexed Crimea and occupied a part of Ukrainian territory. What was the reaction of the other two guarantors? Their official answer at the beginning shocked me. I quote, "The Budapest Memorandum was simply a declaration. It was not legally binding." Well, but why nobody warned us Ukrainians about that at that time? And does it mean that Ukraine is free to restore its nuclear weapons? Of course, I don't want to do that, but I just ask about that. You see that the moral failure of the Budapest Memorandum is enormous. Thanks God, now the leader of the United Kingdom first and the leader of the United States a bit later made their best to restore the justice and provide the necessary military aid. Of course, we Ukrainians feel deep gratitude today to many nations in the world which have clearly expressed their support for Ukraine and made some practical steps in this direction. However, we all see that these steps are partially ineffective because they are belated. So my first conclusion is the following: we cannot build a valid security system, that is peace, through distorting or ignoring values. And now let me turn to the document, the collective document, Longing for Truth That Makes Us Free, that was prepared by representatives of the three branches of Ukrainian Christianity, and I mean Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant. We made an attempt to understand what is going on in our world with truth. And prepare the document. I will try to make familiar it for you. So humanity's primary instrument in restoring the truth was the ability of man to distinguish between good and evil, truth and error. And this implied the presence of the light, the divine truth, since it is possible to recognize darkness only when there is light. Today, in front of our eyes, the devil has tapped into this very ability, I mean ability to distinguish between good and evil, sowing confusion in the minds and souls of people. Let me give you one quote. Information warfare is not about creating an alternate truth, but about eroding our basic ability to distinguish truth at all. The confusion caused by an inability to distinguish between truth and error is a great temptation for the enemy. Powerful institutions dedicate huge budgets to consciously mixing truth and falsehood. These manipulations distort the information space beyond all recognition, leading people to sacrifice their lives for what they believe to be true, although in fact it is not the truth they die for. Many people have lost both direction and perspective. Consciousness as such is destroyed. And as a result, the personal and social political life of people is being destroyed as well. 20 years ago, a political leader caught in a blunt lie would immediately resign and be permanently discredited. Today, lies increasingly guarantee political success and electoral profit, and politicians who have practiced it have buried their spirit and feel no guilt. Let me give you one recent example. Vladimir Putin denied the fact that it was Russian troops that occupied Crimea. But later on, he admitted that, yes, indeed, this was Russian troops, and the whole Russian population agreed with that glorious victory of Putin. So no reaction on the fact that he lied at the beginning. So Jeremiah's words, Prophet Jeremiah's words, are truly prophetic. I quote, an appalling and horrible thing has happened in the land. The prophets prophesy falsely, and the priests rule at their direction. My people love to have it so. I was impressed by these words because my people love to have it so. To emerge from the vicious circle of post-truth, we must recognize the existence of two dimensions. On the one hand, in peer relationships between people and communities, we must recognize that no one person or group is the bearer of ultimate truth. Here, postmodernism has been a great benefit. Aggressive relativism, on the other hand, must acknowledge the chaos it has created. And the vertical dimension must be brought back into the life of the world, namely, the recognition that absolute truth does exist. It is encoded in the DNA of our civilization, and further destruction of this code will lead to the destruction of the world. We see no other way out of this situation than to formulate a post-truth discourse and return to an ethical dimension, in particular, to an ethical assessment of truth and falsehood. The problem will not be solved except by explicitly recognizing a fake to be a lie, and by imposing moral and material sanctions on the producer of the lie. This requires a major reconstruction of the viewpoint postulated by the modern world. So far, I spoke about this post-truth situation mostly theoretically. However, for Ukraine, it is not a theoretical challenge at all. It is exactly the truth what is under the attack of Russia. The Kremlin has launched a powerful information war against our country across the globe. Russia is distorting our desire for independence and the nature of the democratic processes in Ukraine. The fascist clique, nationalists seizing power, and understate are just a few examples of the cliches which the Kremlin uses to disorient the world community. The Kremlin has employed its latest crafty inventions, such as little green men, and they are not there. The Kremlin that gathered massive military troops near Ukrainian border recently blamed Ukraine and NATO for threatening Russia. Lies, lies, endless lies. By these lies, the Putin regime seeks to elude responsibility and becomes like the mockingbirds of Isaiah, prophet Isaiah, who made lies their refuge, and in falsehood have they taken shelter. Isaiah 28:15. Therefore, our times are characterized by an active offensive of evil, the goal of which is simple: to create disorder. In an environment of lies, decisions by governments or voters based on skillfully distorted information are incorrect because they are not based on a real situation. Of course, this year, most countries are able to recognize the major deception. However, the general disorientation and confusion prevail, and it is extremely difficult to seek international solidarity to oppose the evil. As Christians, we know that lies do not exist alone and are accompanied by hatred. The Russian journalist Ilya Milstein recently confirmed that, I quote, "An unprecedented regime built in the Russian Federation is simply unthinkable without hatred," end quote. And Ukrainians are one of the first targets of this hatred. Those who do not read the Russian internet cannot even imagine the level of this hatred. Lowering the threshold for practicing lies inevitably leads to lowering the threshold for using hate speech. Hence, lies are difficult to overcome with logical arguments because they are reinforced by a hatred against which logic is powerless. Lying and hatred are an impetus to violence, and together they constantly push humanity into the abyss. And now let me shortly analyze a few notions which are very typical of modern Western societies, but which proved to be inconsistent at the time of this war. The first notion is dialogue, a very positive achievement of modernity. I'm very thankful to the West for making efforts to incline Russia to dialogue at the beginning. Actually, the concept of dialogue is an antonym to that of war. However, let us take a glance on the way we promoted the principle of dialogue in reality. Since the year 2014 and until recently, in order to prevent war, the West tried to maintain a semblance of dialogue, trying not to concentrate too much on the cynical bullying of world order. As the result, it was this tactic that encouraged Putin to misbehave even more cynically and just recently humiliate the West in quite extraordinary way. Putin lives, as I told, in the culture where the will to find a compromise is the sign of weakness. Seeking an agreement. Again, agreement is very positive notion. Seeking an agreement is a legitimate method of conflict resolution with one very important precondition. If all the parties are willing to find the solution and are ready to stand by agreement. However, Russia has violated many international agreements on Ukraine, including its treaty of friendship and cooperation with Ukraine, as well as the Budapest memorandum I just mentioned. Why some political leaders are so sure that the new treaty with Russia, with Putin's Russia, will be finally trustful? It is virtually impossible to appease Putin as long as Ukraine is independent. He will most certainly violate any peaceful agreement because he seeks conquering Ukraine as the stepping stone to the bigger prize he is pursuing. As French journalist Françoise Thom recently stated, I quote, "Many Europeans are under the illusion that the Kremlin would be willing to accept a neutral Ukraine on the model of Finland. This amounts to misunderstanding Putin's regime and to forget the obsessions of the Russian president," end quote. His strategic goal is to re-establish the former bipolar world in which Russia played a major role in its opposition to the West, or at least to establish the three-polar world, including China. Putin's ambitions hinge on becoming one of the leaders of this successful new order, which aims to destroy the totally rotten world of old Europe. As you may see, instead of Finlandization of Ukraine, as was proposed at the beginning, what happened now was the Ukrainization of Finland. Now Finland wanted to join NATO as Ukraine wanted recently. So we see that it is that we face the challenge of an attempt to build a successful new order based on authoritarianism, not democratic rules. And we have to deal with this new challenge. Compromise, again, it is very legitimate in a conflict resolution. But this logic seems to be in a distorted way presented by about Macron. He presupposed the following two elements of some possible peaceful agreement with Putin: to recognize the legitimate concerns of Russia and to incline Ukraine to make some concessions. So let us analyze the moral aspects of both of them. To recognize the legitimate concerns of Russia. As Macron stated, it is legitimate for Russia to raise the question of its own security. Who might question the validity of this statement? Of course, the security of the Russian nation has to be granted. However, the phrase is not valid when we speak about the security of the eventual Russian Empire to be re-established, because imperialistic dreams of Putin and his will of reversing the verdict of the Cold War and re-establishing of the Soviet Union are not legitimate. Otherwise, we have to confirm that it was legitimate for Nazi Germany to raise the question of its own security in Danzig and Sudetenland. So, as you see, this is a very strange situation. I understand that the modern Western civilization is afraid to demonize any government, because in the world of ordinary conflicts, excessive demonization by an adversary is usually the main barrier to reconciliation. However, reconciliation is not the goal of the Kremlin. Unconditional surrender of Ukraine and that of the West, this is the ultimate goal of Putin. To turn the blind eye to that might be the unrecoverable mistake. So let me go to the conclusion. As you see, I used many well-known words during my lecture, as dialogue, agreement, cooperation, and so on. It was the world of win-win principle that illustrated the will of the world to live in a peaceful environment. But we see that there are different interpretations of these words because there is no consensus on good and evil, on truth and lie. Because we do not have a consensus. Now we are within the world of different misinterpretations that pretend to be legitimate because, well, nobody has an absolute truth. So Putin's interpretation is as valid and as legitimate as the interpretation of any other political leader and country. So this is the challenge we have to face and we have to deal with. For us Christians, it has to be obvious that the fundamental solution to the security dilemma lies not in the political, but in the value sphere. Any attempts to guarantee security at the expense of values will not produce a lasting effect. Distorted values will give rise to changes of the international order, which will become even more dangerous. So let me conclude with that, and I will be glad to answer your questions.